of the biblical mandates to the human being to act, to create history, to not just be one who contemplates what happens anyway, but rather to be an active participant in history. That's what we find in Genesis when God said to Adam and Eve that they should have dominion, that they should subdue the earth. And dominion was not to be understood as to dominate, but rather to figure out how creation works, what God has put into it of his own character, of his own imagination, of his own power, and then to play with that, to make use of it, to enjoy the discovery, and to turn it into beneficial consequences. And then the Bible goes on and says there's also been this rupture, this fall, this rebellion of Adam and Eve against God that produced a situation that is now damaged, so that we can no longer look at God's creation and say that reveals to us the mind of God and the moral character of God. Because as we all know, when we look at nature, we find a highly conflictual situation. There are many beautiful things. There's a fundamental harmony that we describe in physical laws. But there's also tremendous conflict. There's death. There is big animals eating little animals, or sometimes the other way around, more gradually, but still the same way. And there's much hostility. Things are not only natural, but sometimes they're also abnormal. They're not what God intended it to be. And most centrally, where we notice that is in the reality of death. That's what Adam and Eve were told. If you transgress, if you walk away from God, there is no other world, and you will die. You will die morally as judged because you have committed a sin, you have disobeyed, you have fooled yourself, you've believed something that's impossible, and you will die physically. You have a body that will return to dust because, as we read in Genesis 2, from dust the body was made when God created human beings. And so the mandates in Scripture contain both the mandate to create, to have ideas of what else I can do, with the givens, what else is there not immediately seen, but for instance under the earth or under the water that is not visible to us, but we look for it, as well as the mandates to repair, to not just accept the way things are as somehow final or willed by God or necessary, but rather to constantly struggle to improve on this tragedy that is ours in a now fallen world. And of course, we have not only in Genesis, in the rest of Scripture, the prophets come and speak to the people of Israel and say, how did you think you get away with breaking the law, treating your neighbor as if he were your enemy, killing pregnant women, doing injustice, not keeping the law, etc., etc. You have the prophets expressing that encouragement to not just take things as they happen, but to always critique them from a moral perspective and to make the distinction between what is and what ought to be. And likewise, you find it, of course, in the person of Christ, who comes as the express image of the Father, not to tell us everything is okay, but to tell us you're right when you acknowledge that things are not okay. The Pharisaic arguments were untrue. Those that suffered should be healed. Those that were neglected should be respected as human beings. Death at the tomb of Lazarus is a cruelty, a terrible thing, and therefore we find Christ not only weeping, which could be explained in terms of his emotions, but much stronger. In John 11 it says Jesus was furious. He was moved in his guts, is the strong translation, the good translation of the strong Greek verb. Because this is a very upsetting that in God's kingdom, a holy and good God, there would be such a thing as death. And so he's very upset about it, and then raises him from the dead to point out to us that we don't look forward to sort of move in these cycles of everybody who's born will also die, but rather death is something to be fought. These are not equally acceptable phenomena. They may be for a scientific dissertation, when you study what happens to the cell walls at birth and the multiplication of cells in the mother's womb until the baby is born, or when you study the decline of death and the loss of brain cells from the time you're 24 on. So I imagine you're all over 24, your brain has begun to die. And then eventually, of course, the falling apart of the body that ends in death. We are not just to look at them as equally interesting, except for the scientific thesis, But in terms of life and human relationships and respecting a person, they are radically opposed to each other on the basis of what Scripture tells us, that God did not intend death to be there from the beginning. It is the last enemy that Christ also will conquer. It is a result of the fall and of sin. And born of such parents, we all are marked by death. Or as Proust would say, there is the dust of death on all reality. So that's the biblical framework within which we consider these things. The real and the ideal encourages us to think about real options. Real because they relate to what is possible in reality. The ideal is a fiction of one's imagination, a picture. That's the meaning of the Greek word that's behind our word ideal. It's an image in our mind which may or may not be able to be translated into reality. Slovakia, I mentioned, that land in Bruegel's painting, I think it's Bruegel, of fried chicken, roasted chickens flying through the air so that you no longer have to work. You lie under an apple tree and the ripe apples fall into your mouth. That's Slovakia. There are other names for such things. These are realities portrayed in one's mind and one's rich imagination, but they are not realizable, and therefore they're not real in that sense. And yet, over the last several centuries, what we've had, and I think probably in all human history,